All right, and now we have here some more real-time drawings. You will notice at a couple moments the camera does go a little bit out of focus, but just consider it artistic blurriness or something like that. Anyways, I'm going to read some more fairy tales for you written by Hans Christian Andersen. We'll start out with The Steadfast Tin Soldier, written in 1838. There were once 25 tin soldiers. They were all brothers, born of the same old tin spoon. They shouldered their muskets and looked straight ahead of them, splendid in their uniforms, all red and blue. The very first thing in the world that they heard was, "Tin soldiers!" A small boy shouted it and clapped his hands as the lid was lifted off their box on his birthday. He immediately set them up on the table. All the soldiers looked exactly alike except one. He looked a little different, as he had been cast last of all. The tin was short, so he had only one leg. But there he stood, as steady on one leg as any of the other soldiers on their two. But just as you see, he'll be the remarkable one. On the table with the soldiers were many other playthings, and one that no eye could miss was a marvelous castle of cardboard. It had little windows through which you could look right inside it, and in front of the castle were miniature trees around a little mirror supposed to represent a lake. The wax swans that swam on its surface were reflected in the mirror. All of this was very pretty, but prettiest of all was the little lady who stood in the open doorway of the castle. Though she was a paper doll, she wore a dress of the fluffiest gauze. A tiny blue ribbon went over her shoulder for a scarf, and in the middle of it shone a spangle that was as big as her face. The little lady held out both her arms, as a ballet dancer does, and one leg was lifted so high behind her that the tin soldier couldn't see it at all, and he supposed she must have only one leg, as he did. "That would be a wife for me," he thought, "but maybe she's too grand. She lives in a castle. I have only a box with 24 roommates to share it. That's no place for her, but I must try to make her acquaintance." Still as stiff as when he stood at attention, he laid down on the table behind a snuff-box where he could admire the dainty little dancer who kept standing on one leg without ever losing her balance. When the evening came, the other tin soldiers were put away in their box, and the people of the house went to bed. Now the toys began to play amongst themselves at visits and battles and at giving balls. The tin soldiers rattled about in their box, for they wanted to play too, but they could not get the lid open. The nutcracker turned somersaults, and the slate pencil squeaked out jokes on the slate. The toys made such a noise that they woke up the canary bird, who made them a speech, all in verse. The only two who stayed still were the tin soldier and the little dancer. Without ever swerving from the tip of one toe, she held out her arms to him, and the tin soldier was just as steadfast on his one leg. Not once did he take his eyes off of her. Then the clock struck 12, and crack! Up popped the lid of the snuff-box. But there was no snuff in it. No, out bounced a little black bogey, a jack-in-the-box. "Tin soldier," he said, "will you please keep your eyes to yourself?" The tin soldier pretended not to hear. The bogey said, "Just you wait till tomorrow." When morning came and the children got up, the soldier was set out on the window ledge, and whether the bogey did it or there was a gust of wind, all of a sudden the window flew open, and the soldier pitched out headlong from the 3rd floor. He fell at breathtaking speed and landed cap first with his bayonet buried between the paving stones and his one leg stuck straight in the air. The housemaid and the little boy ran down to look for him, and, though they nearly stepped on the tin soldier, they walked right past without seeing him. If the soldier had called, "Here I am," they would have surely found him, but he thought it contemptible to raise an uproar while he was wearing his uniform. Soon it began to rain. The drops fell faster and faster, until they came down by the bucketful. As soon as the rain let up, along came 2 young rapscallions. "Hi, look," one of them said. "There's a tin soldier. Let's send him sailing." They made a boat out of newspaper, put the tin soldier in the middle of it, and away he went down the gutter with the 2 young rapscallions running beside him and clapping their hands. High heavens! How the waves splashed and how the fast water ran down the gutter. Don't forget that it had just been raining by the bucketful. The paper boat pitched and tossed, and sometimes it whirled about so rapidly that it made the soldier's head spin. But he stood as steady as ever. Never once flinching, he kept his eyes front and carried his gun shoulder high. Suddenly the boat rushed under a long plank, where the gutter was boarded over. It was as dark as the soldier's own box. Where can I be going? The soldier wondered. This must be that black bogey's revenge. Ah, if only I had the little lady with me. It could be twice as dark here for all that I would care. Out popped a great water rat who lived under the gutter plank. "Have you a passport?" said the rat. "Hand it over." The soldier kept quiet and held his musket tighter. On rushed the boat, and the rat came right after it, gnashing its teeth as he called to the sticks and straws. "Halt him! Stop him! He didn't pay his toll, and he hasn't shown his passport." But the current ran stronger and stronger. The soldier could see daylight ahead where the board ended, but he also heard a roar that would frighten the bravest of us. Hold on, right at the end of that gutter plank. The water poured into the great canal. It was as dangerous to him as a waterfall would be to us. He was so near it, he could not possibly stop. The boat plunged into the whirlpool. The poor tin soldier stood as staunch as he could, and no one can say that he so much as blinked an eye. Thrice and again the boat spun around. It filled to the top, and was bound to sink. The water was up to his neck, and still the boat went down deeper, deeper, deeper. The paper got soft and limp, and when the water rushed over his head, he thought of the pretty little dancer whom he'd never see again, and in his ears rang an old, old song. "Farewell, farewell, O warrior brave, nobody can from death thee save." And now the paper boat broke beneath him, and the soldier sank right through, and just at that moment he was swallowed by a most enormous fish. My, how dark it was inside that fish! It was darker than under the gutter plank, and it was so cramped, but the tin soldier was still staunch. He lay there, full length, soldier fashion, with musket to soldier. Then the fish flopped and floundered in a most unaccountable way. Finally it was perfectly still, and after a while something struck through him like a flash of lightning. The tin soldier saw daylight again, and he heard a voice say, "The tin soldier." The fish had been caught, carried to market, bought, and brought to a kitchen, where the cook cut him open with her big knife. She picked the soldier up bodily between her two fingers and carried him off upstairs. Everyone wanted to see this remarkable traveler who had traveled about in a fish's stomach, but the tin soldier took no pride in it. They put him on the table, and, lo and behold, what curious things can happen in this world, there he was, back in the same room as before. He saw the same children, the same toys were on the table, and there was the same fine castle with the pretty little dancer. She still balanced on one leg with the other raised high. She, too, was steadfast. That touched the soldier so deeply that he would have cried 10 tears. Only soldiers never cry. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and never a word was said. Just as things were going so nicely for them, one of the little boys snatched up the tin soldier and threw him into the stove. He did it for no reason at all. That black bogey in the snuff box must have put him up to it. The tin soldier stood there dressed in flames. He felt a terrible heat, but whether it came from the flames or from his love, he didn't know. He'd lost his splendid colors, maybe from his hard journey, maybe from grief. Nobody can say. He looked at the little lady, and she looked at him, and he felt himself melting, but still he stood steadfast, with his musket held trim on his shoulder. Then the door blew open. A puff of wind struck the dancer. She flew like a sylph straight into the fire with the soldier, blazed up in a flash, and was gone. The tin soldier melted, all in a lump. The next day, when a servant took up the ashes, she found him in the shape of a little tin heart. But of the pretty dancer nothing was left except her spangle, and it was burned as black as a coal. This next story is called The Wild Swans, written in 1838 by Hans Christian Andersen. Far, far away, where the swallows fly when we have winter, there lived a king who had 11 sons and 1 daughter, Elisa. The 11 brothers, princes all, each went to school with a star at his breast and a sword at his side. They wrote with pencils of diamond upon golden slates, and could say their lessons by heart just as easily as they could read it from the book. You could tell at a glance how princely they were. Their sister, Elisa, sat on a little footstool of flawless glass. She had a picture book that had cost half a kingdom. Oh, the children had a very fine time, but it did not last forever. Their father, who was king over the whole country, married a wicked queen who did not treat his poor children at all well. They found that out the very first day. There was feasting throughout the palace, and the children played at entertaining guests. But instead of letting them have all the cakes and baked apple pies that they used to get, their new stepmother gave them only some sand in a teacup and told them to make believe that it was a special treat. The following week the queen sent little Elisa to live in the country with some peasants, and before long she had the king believe so many falsehoods about the poor princes that he took no further interest in them. "Fly out into the world and make your own living," the wicked queen told them. "Fly away like big birds without a voice." But she did not harm the princes as much as she meant to, for they turned into 11 magnificent white swans. With a weird cry, they flew out of the palace window across the park into the woods. It was so early in the morning that their sister Elisa was still asleep when they flew over the peasant hut where she was staying. They hovered over the roofs, craning and twisting their long necks and flapping their wings, but nobody saw them or heard them. They were forced to fly on, high up near the clouds and far away into the wide world. They came down in a vast, dark forest that stretched down to the shores of the sea. Poor little Elisa stayed in the peasant hut and played boo with a green leaf, for she had no other toy. She made a little hole in the leaf and looked through it at the sun. Through it she seemed to see her brother's bright eyes, and whenever the warm sunlight touched her cheek, it reminded her of all their kisses. One day passed like all the others. When the wind stirred the hedge-roses outside the hut, it whispered to them, "What could be prettier than you?" But the roses shook their heads and answered, "Elisa." And on Sunday, when the old woman sat in the doorway reading the Psalms, the wind fluttered through the pages and said to the book, "Who could be more saintly than you?" "Elisa," the book testified. What it and the roses said was perfectly true. Elisa was to go back home when she became 15, but as soon as the queen saw what a beautiful princess she was, the queen felt spiteful and full of hatred toward her. She would not have hesitated to turn her into a wild swan like her brothers, but she did not dare to do it just yet, because the king wanted to see his daughter. In the early morning the queen went to the bathing place, which was made of white marble, furnished with soft cushions and carpeted with the most splendid rugs. She took 3 toads, kissed them, and said to the first, "Squat on Elisa's head when she bathes, so that she will become as torpid as you are." To the second she said, "Squat on her forehead, so that she will become as ugly as you are, and her father won't recognize her." And to the third she whispered, "Lie against her heart, so that she will be cursed and tormented by evil desires." Thereupon the queen dropped the 3 toads into the clear water, which at once turned a greenish color. She called Elisa, made her undress, and told her to enter the bath. When Elisa went down into the water, 1 toad fastened himself to her hair, another to her forehead, and the third against her heart. But she did not seem to be aware of them, and when she stood up, 3 red poppies floated on the water. If the toads had not been poisonous and had not been kissed by the witch, they would have been turned into red roses, but at least they had been turned into flowers by the mere touch of her head and heart. She was too innocent and good for witchcraft to have power over her. When the evil queen realized this, she rubbed Elisa with a walnut stain that turned her dark brown and smeared her beautiful face with a vile ointment, and tousled her lovely hair. No one could have recognized the beautiful Elisa, and when her father saw her, he was shocked. He said that this could not be his daughter. No one knew her except the watchdog and the swallows, and they were humble creatures who had nothing to say. Poor Elisa cried and thought of her 11 brothers who were all away. Heavy-hearted, she stole away from the palace and wandered all day long over fields and marshes till she came to the vast forest. She had no idea where to turn. All she felt was her sorrow and her longing to be with her brothers. Like herself, they must have been driven out into the world, and she set her heart upon finding them. She had been in the forest only a little while when night came on, and as she had strayed from any sign of a path, she said her prayers and lay down on the soft moss, with her head pillowed against a stump. All was quiet. The air was so mild, and hundreds of fireflies glittered like a green fire in the grass and moss. When she slightly brushed against a single branch, the shining insects showered about her like falling stars. She dreamed of her brothers all night long. They were children again, playing together, writing with their diamond pencils on their golden slates, and looking at her wonderful picture book that had cost half a kingdom. But they no longer scribbled sums and exercises as they used to. No, they set down their bold deeds, and all that they had seen or heard. Everything in the picture book came alive. The birds sang, and the people strolled out of the book to talk with Elisa and her brothers. But whenever she turned to a page, they immediately jumped back into place to keep the pictures in order. When she awoke, the sun was already high. She could not see it plainly, for the tall trees spread their tangled branches above her, but the rays played above like a shimmering golden gauze. There was a delightful fragrance of green foliage, and the birds came near enough to have perched on her shoulder. She heard the water splashing from many large springs, which all flowed into a pool with the most beautiful sandy bottom. Although it was hemmed in by a wall of thick bushes, there was one place where the deer had made a path wide enough for Elisa to reach the water. The pool was so clear that, if the wind had not stirred the limbs and brushes, she might have supposed they were painted on the bottom of the pool, for each leaf was clearly reflected, whether the sun shone upon it, or whether it grew in the shade. When Elisa saw her own face, she was horrified to find it so brown and ugly, but as soon as she wet her slender hand and rubbed her brow and her eyes, her fair skin showed again. Then she laid aside her clothes and plunged into the water fresh. In all the world there was no king's daughter as lovely as Elisa. When she had dressed herself and plaited her long hair, she went to the sparkling spring and drank from the hollow of her hand. She wandered deeper into the woods without knowing whither she went. She thought of her brothers, and she thought of the good Lord, who she knew would not forsake her. He lets the wild crab apples grow to feed the hungry, and he led her footsteps to a tree with its branches bent down by the weight of their fruit. Here she had her lunch. After she put props under the heavy limbs, she went into the depths of the forest. It was so quiet that she heard her own footsteps in every dry leaf that rustled underfoot. Not a bird was in sight. Not a ray of the sun could get through the big, heavy branches, and the tall trees grew so close together that when she looked straight ahead, it seemed as if a solid fence of lofty palings imprisoned her. She had never known such solitude. The night came on, pitch black. Not one firefly glittered among the leaves as she despondently lay down to sleep. Then it seemed to her that the branches parted overhead, and the Lord looked kindly down upon her, and little angels peeped out from above his head and behind him. When she awoke the next morning, she did not know whether she had dreamed this or whether it had really happened. A few steps farther on, she met an old woman who had a basket of berries and gave some of them to her. Elisa asked if she had seen 11 princes riding through the forest. "No," said the old woman, "but yesterday I saw 11 swans who wore golden crowns. They were swimming in the river not far from here." She led Elisa a little way to the top of a hill which sloped down to a winding river. The trees on either bank stretched their long leafy branches toward each other, and where the stream was too wide for them to grow across it, they had torn their roots from the earth and leaned out over the water until their branches met. Elisa told the old woman goodbye and followed the river down to where it flowed into the great open sea. Before the young girl lay the whole beautiful sea, but not a sail nor a single boat was in sight. How could she go on? She looked at the countless pebbles on the beach and saw how round the water had worn them. Glass, iron ore, stones, all that had been washed up and been shaped by the water that was so much softer than even her tender hand. It rolls on tirelessly, and that is the way it makes such hard things smooth, she said. I shall be just as untiring. Thank you for your lesson, you clear, rolling waves. My heart tells me that someday you will carry me to my beloved brothers." Among the seaweed, she found 11 white swan feathers, which she collected in a sheaf. There were still drops of water on them, but whether these were spray or tears no one could say. It was very lonely along the shore, but she did not mind, for the sea was constantly changing. Indeed, it showed more changes in a few hours than an inland lake does in a whole year. When the sky was black with threatening clouds, it was as if the sea seemed to say, "I can look threatening too." Then the wind would blow and the waves would raise their white crests. But when the wind died down and the clouds were red, the sea would look like a rose petal. Sometimes it showed white and sometimes green, but however calm it might seem, there was always a gentle lapping along the shore where the waters rose and fell like the chest of a child asleep. Just at sunset, Elisa saw 11 white swans with golden crowns on their heads fly towards the shore. As they flew, one behind another, they looked like a white ribbon floating in the air. Elisa climbed up and hid behind a bush on the steep bank. The swans came down near her and flapped their magnificent white wings. As soon as the sun went down beyond the sea, the swans threw off their feathers, and there stood 11 handsome princes. They were her brothers, and, although they were greatly altered, she knew in her heart that she could not be mistaken. She cried aloud and rushed into their arms, calling them each by name. The princes were so happy to see their little sister, and they knew her at once, for all that she had grown tall and lovely. They laughed and they cried, and they soon realized how cruelly their stepmother had treated them all. "We brothers," said the eldest, "are forced to fly about disguised as wild swans as long as the sun is in the heavens. But when it goes down, we take back our human form. So at sunset we must always look about us for some firm foothold, because if ever we were flying among the clouds at sunset, we would be dashed down to earth. We do not live on this coast. Beyond the sea there is another land as fair as this, but it lies far away, and we must cross the vast ocean to reach it. Along our course there is not one island where we can pass the night, except one little rock that rises from the middle of the sea. It is barely big enough to hold us, however close together we stand, and if there is a rough sea, the waves wash over us. But still we thank God for it. In our human forms we rest there during the night, and without it we could never come back to our own dear homeland. It takes 2 of the longest days of the year for our journey. We are allowed to come back to our native land only once a year, and we do not dare to stay longer than 11 days. As we fly over this forest, we can see the palace where our father lives and where we were born. We can see the high tower of the church where our mother lies buried. And here we feel that even the trees and bushes are akin to us. Here the wild horses gallop across the moors as we saw them in our childhood, and the charcoal burner sings the same old songs to which we used to dance when we were children. This is our homeland. It draws to us, and here, dear sister, we have found you again. We may stay 2 days longer, and then we must fly across the sea to a land which is fair enough, but not our own. How shall we take you with us, for we have neither ship nor boat?" "How shall I set you free?" their sister asked, and they talked on for most of the night, sparing only a few hours for sleep. In the morning, Elisa was awakened by the rustling of swans' wings overhead. Her brothers, once more enchanted, wheeled above her in great circles until they were out of sight. One of them, her youngest brother, stayed with her and rested his head on her breast while she stroked his wings. They spent the whole day together, and toward evening the others returned. As soon as the sun went down, they resumed their own shape. "Tomorrow," said one of the brothers, "we must fly away, and we dare not return until a whole year has passed. But we cannot leave you like this. Have you courage enough to come with us? My arm is strong enough to carry you through the forest, so surely the wings of all of us should be strong enough to bear you across the sea." "Yes, take me with you," said Elisa. They spent the entire night making a net of pliant willow bark and tough rushes. They made it large and strong. Elisa lay down upon it, and when the sun rose and her brothers again became swans, they lifted the net in their bills and flew high up toward the clouds with their beloved sister, who was still fast asleep. As the sun shone straight into her face, one of the swans flew overhead so as to shade her with his wide wings. They were far from the shore when she awoke. Elisa thought she must be still dreaming, so strange did it seem to be carried in the air, high over the sea. Beside her lay a branch full of beautiful ripe berries and a bundle of sweet-tasting roots. Her youngest brother had gathered them and put them there for her. She gave him a grateful smile. She knew he must be the one who flew over her head to protect her eyes from the sun. They were so high that the first ship they sighted looked like a gull floating in the water. A cloud rolled up behind them as big as a mountain. Upon it, Elisa saw gigantic shadows of herself and of the 11 swans. It was the most splendid picture she had ever seen, but as the sun rose higher, the clouds grew small, and the shadow picture of their flight disappeared. All day they flew like arrows whipping through the air, and yet, because they had their sister to carry, they flew more slowly than on their former journeys. Night was drawing near, and a storm was rising. In terror, Elisa watched the sinking sun, for the lonely rock was nowhere in sight. It seemed to her that the swans beat their wings in the air more desperately. Alas, it was because of her that they could not fly fast enough. So, as soon as the sun went down, they would turn into men, and all of them would pitch down into the sea and drown. She prayed to God from the depths of her heart, but still no rock could be seen. Black clouds gathered, and great gusts told of the storm to come. The threatening clouds came on as one tremendous wave that rolled down toward them like a mass of lead, and flash upon flash of lightning followed them. Then the sun touched the rim of the sea. Elisa's heart beat madly as the swans shot down so fast that she thought they were falling, but they checked their downward swoop. Half of the sun was below the sea when she first saw the little rock below them. It looked no larger than the head of a seal jutting out of the water. The sun sank very fast. Now it was no bigger than a star, but her foot touched solid ground. Then the sun went out like the last spark on a piece of burning paper. She saw her brothers stand about her arm in arm, and there was only just enough room for all of them. The waves beat upon the rock and washed over them in a shower of spray. The heavens were lit by constant flashes, and bolt upon bolt of thunder crashed. But the sister and the brothers clasped each other's hands and sang a psalm, which comforted them and gave them courage. At dawn the air was clear and still. As soon as the sun came up, the swans flew off with Elisa, and they left the rock behind. The waves still tossed, and from the height where they soared it looked as if the white flecks of foam against the dark green waves were millions of white swans swimming upon the waters. When the sun rose higher, Elisa saw before her a mountainous land, half floating in the air. Its peaks were capped with sparkling ice, and in the middle rose a castle that was a mile long, with one bold colonnade perched upon another. Down below, palm trees swayed, and brilliant flowers bloomed as big as mill wheels. She asked if this was the land for which they were bound, but the swans shook their heads. What she saw was the gorgeous and ever-changing palace of Fata Morgana. No mortal being could venture to enter it. As Elisa stared at it, before her eyes the mountains, palms, and palace faded away, and in their place rose 20 splendid churches, all alike with lofty towers and pointed windows. She thought she heard the organ peal, but it was the roll of the ocean she heard. When she came close to the churches, they turned into a fleet of ships sailing beneath her, but when she looked down, it was only a sea mist drifting over the water. Scene after scene shifted before her eyes until she saw at last the real country whither they went. Mountains rose before her, beautifully blue, wooded with cedars and studded with cities and palaces. Long before sunset, she was sitting on a mountainside, in front of a cave carpeted over with green creepers so delicate that they looked like embroidery. "We shall see what you'll dream of here tonight," her youngest brother said, as he showed her where she was to sleep. "I only wish I could dream of how to set you free," she said. This thought so completely absorbed her, and she prayed so earnestly for the Lord to help her, that even in her sleep she kept on praying. It seemed to her that she was flying aloft to the Fata Morgana palace of clouds. The fairy who came out to meet her was fair and shining, yet she closely resembled the old woman who gave her the berries in the forest and told her of the swans who wore golden crowns on their heads. "Your brothers can be set free," she said, "but have you the courage and tenacity to do it? The sea water that changes the shape of rough stones is indeed softer than your delicate hands, but It cannot feel the pain that your fingers will feel. It has no heart, so it cannot suffer the anguish and heartache that you will have to endure. Do you see this stinging nettle in my hand? Many such nettles grow around the cave where you sleep. Only those and the ones that grow upon the graves in the churchyards may be used. Remember that. Those you must gather, and although they will burn your hands to blisters, crush the nettles with your feet, and you will have flax, which you must spin and weave into 11 shirts of mail with long sleeves. Once you throw these over the 11 wild swans, the spell over them is broken. But keep this well in mind. From the moment you undertake this task until it is done, even though it lasts for years, you must not speak. The first word you say will strike your brothers' hearts like a deadly knife. Their lives are at the mercy of your tongue. Now, remember what I told you. She touched Elisa's hand with nettles that burned like fire and awakened her. It was broad daylight, and close at hand where she had been sleeping grew a nettle like those of which she had dreamed. She thanked God upon her knees and left the cave to begin her task. With her soft hand she took hold of the dreadful nettles that seared like fire. Great blisters rose on her hands and arms, but she endured it gladly in the hope that she could free her beloved brothers. She crushed each nettle with her bare feet and spun the green flax. When her brothers returned at sunset, it alarmed them that she did not speak. They feared this was some new spell cast by their wicked stepmother, but when they saw her hands, they understood that she labored to save them. The youngest one wept, and wherever his tears touched Elisa, she felt no more pain, and the burning blisters healed. She toiled throughout the night, for she could not rest until she had delivered her beloved brothers from the enchantment. Throughout the next day, while the swans were gone, she sat all alone, but never had the time sped so quickly. One shirt was made, and she set to work on the second one. Then she heard the blast of a hunting horn on the mountainside. It frightened her, for the sound came nearer until she could hear the hounds bark. Terror-stricken, she ran into the cave, bundled together the nettles she had gathered and woven, and sat down on this bundle. Immediately a big dog came bounding from the thicket, followed by another and still another, all barking loudly as they ran to and fro. In a very few minutes all the huntsmen stood in front of the cave. The most handsome of these was the king of the land, and he came up to Elisa. Never before had he seen a girl so beautiful. "My lovely child," he said, "how do you come to be here?" Elisa shook her head, for she did not dare to speak. Her brother's deliverance and their very lives depended upon it, and she hid her hands under her apron to keep the king from seeing how much she suffered. "Come with me," he told her. "You cannot stay here. If you are as good as you are fair, I shall clothe you in silk and velvet, set a golden crown upon your head, and give you my finest palace to live in." Then he lifted her upon his horse. When she wept and wrung her hands, the king told her, "My only wish is to make you happy. Some day you will thank me for this." Off through the mountains he spurred, holding her before him on his horse as his huntsmen galloped behind them. At sundown his splendid city with all its towers and domes lay before them. The king led her into his palace, where great fountains played in the high marble halls, and where both walls and ceilings were adorned with paintings. But she took no notice of any of these things. She could only weep and grieve. Indifferently, she let the woman dress her in royal garments, weave strings of pearls in her hair, and draw soft gloves over her blistered fingers. She was so dazzlingly beautiful in all this splendor that the whole court bowed even deeper than before, and the king chose her for his bride, although the archbishop shook his head and whispered that this lovely maid of the woods must be a witch who had blinded their eyes and stolen the king's heart. But the king would not listen to him. He commanded that music be played, the costliest dishes be served, and that the prettiest girls dance for her. She was shown through sweet-scented gardens and into magnificent halls, but nothing could make her lips smile or her eyes sparkle. Sorrow had set its seal upon them. At length the king opened the door to a little chamber adjoining her bedroom. It was covered with splendid green embroideries, and looked just like the cave in which he had found her. On the floor lay the bundle of flax she had spun from the nettles, and from the ceiling hung the shirt she had already finished. One of the huntsmen had brought these with him as curiosities. Here you may dream that you are back in your old home. The king told her, here's the work that you were doing there, and surrounded by all your splendor, here it may amuse you to think of those times. When Elisa saw these things that were so precious to her, a smile trembled on her lips, and the blood rushed back to her cheeks. The hope that she could free her brothers returned to her, and she kissed the king's hand. He pressed her to his heart and commanded that all the church bells peal to announce their wedding. The beautiful mute girl from the forest was to be the country's queen. The archbishop whispered evil words in the king's ear, but they did not reach his heart. The wedding was to take place. The archbishop himself had to place the crown on her head. Out of spite, he forced the tight circlet so low on her forehead that it hurt her. But a heavier band encircled her heart, and the sorrow she felt for her brothers kept her from feeling any hurt of the flesh. Her lips were mute, for one single word would mean death to her brothers, but her eyes shone with love for the kind and handsome king who did his best to please her. Every day she grew fonder and fonder of him in her heart. Oh, if only she could confide in him and tell him what grieved her, but mute she must remain and finish her task in silence. So at night she would steal away from his side into her little chamber which resembled the cave, and there she wove one shirt after another. But when she set to work on the 7th, there was not enough flax left to finish it. She knew that the nettles she must use grew in the churchyard, but she had to gather them herself. How could she go there? Oh, what is the pain in my fingers compared with the anguish I feel in my heart, she thought. I must take the risk, and the good Lord will not desert me. As terrified as if she were doing some evil thing, she tiptoed down into the moonlit garden, through the long alleys and down the deserted streets to the churchyard. There she saw a group of vampires sitting in a circle on one of the large gravestones. These hideous ghouls took off their ragged clothes as they were about to bathe. With skinny fingers they clawed open the new graves. Greedily they snatched out the bodies and ate the flesh from them. Elisa had to pass close to them, and they fixed their vile eyes upon her, but she said a prayer, picked the stinging nettles, and carried them back to the palace. Only one man saw her, the archbishop. He was awake while the others slept. Now he had the proof of what he had suspected. There was something wrong with the queen. She was a witch, and that was how she had duped the king and all his people. In the confessional, he told the king what he had seen and what he feared. As the bitter words spewed from his mouth, the images of the saints shook their heads, as much to say, he lies. Elisa is innocent. The archbishop, however, had a different explanation for this. He said they were testifying against her and shaking their heads at her wickedness. 2 big tears rolled down the king's cheeks as he went home with suspicion in his heart. That night he pretended to be asleep, but no restful sleep touched his eyes. He watched Elisa get out of bed. Every night he watched her get up, and each time he followed her quietly and saw her disappear into her private little room. Day after day his frown deepened. Elisa saw it and could not understand why this should be, but it made her anxious and added to the grief her heart already felt for her brothers. Her hot tears fell down upon her queenly robes of purple velvet. There they flashed like diamonds, and all who saw this splendor wished that they were queen. Meanwhile, she had almost completed her task. Only one shirt was lacking, but again she ran out of flax. Not a single nettle was left. Once more, for the last time, she must go to the churchyard and pluck a few more handfuls. She thought with fear of the lonely walk and the ghastly vampires, but her will was as strong as her faith in God. She went upon her mission, but the king and his archbishop followed. They saw her disappear through the iron gates of the churchyard, and when they came in after her, they saw vampires sitting on a gravestone, just as Elisa had seen them. The king turned away, for he thought Elisa was among them, Elisa whose head had rested against his heart that very evening. "Let the people judge her," he said, and the people did judge her. They condemned her to die by fire. She was led from her splendid royal halls to a dungeon, dark and damp, where the wind whistled in between the window bars. Instead of silks and velvets, they gave her, for a pillow, the bundle of nettles she had gathered, and for her coverlet, the harsh, burning shirts of mail she had woven. But they could have given her nothing that pleased her more. She set to work again and prayed. Outside, the boys in the street sang jeering songs about her, and not one soul came to comfort her with a kind word. But toward evening she heard the rustle of a swan's wings close to her window. It was her youngest brother who had found her at last. She sobbed for joy. Though she knew that this night was all too apt to be her last, the task was almost done and her brothers were near her. The archbishop came to stay with her during her last hours on earth, for this much he had promised the king. But she shook her head and, by her expression and gestures, begged him to leave. This was the last night she had to finish her task, or it would all go for naught. All her pain and her tears and her sleepless nights. The archbishop went away, saying cruel things about her. But poor Elisa knew her own innocence, and she kept on with her task. The little mice ran about on the floor and brought nettles to her feet, trying to help her all they could. And a thrush perched near the bars of her window to sing the whole night through as merrily as he could, so that she would keep up her courage. It was still in the early dawn, an hour before sunrise, when the 11 brothers reached the palace gates and demanded to see the king. This, they were told, was impossible. It was still night. The king was asleep and could not be disturbed. They begged and threatened so loudly that the guard turned out, and even the king came running to find what the trouble was. But at that instant the sun rose, and the 11 brothers vanished. 11 swans were seen flying over the palace. All the townsmen went flocking out through the town gates, for they wanted to see the witch burned. A decrepit old horse pulled the cart in which Elisa sat. They had dressed her in coarse sackcloth, and all her lovely long hair hung loose about her beautiful head. Her cheeks were deathly pale, and her lips moved in silent prayer as her fingers twisted the green flax. Even on her way to death, she did not stop her still unfinished work. 10 shirts lay at her feet, and she worked away on the 11th. "See how the witch mumbles," the mob scoffed at her. "That's no psalm book in her hands. No, there she sits nursing her filthy sorcery. Snatch it away from her. Tear it to bits." The crowd of people closed in to destroy all her work, but before they could reach her, 11 white swans flew down and made a ring around the cart with their flapping wings. The mob drew back in terror. "It's a sign from heaven. She must be innocent," many people whispered, but no one dared say it aloud. As the executioner seized her arm, she made haste to throw the 11 shirts over the swans, who instantly became 11 handsome princes. But the youngest brother still had a swan's wing in place of one arm, where a sleeve was missing from his shirt. Elisa had not quite been able to finish it. "Now," she cried, "I may speak. I am innocent." All the people who saw what had happened bowed down to her as they would before a saint. But the strain, the anguish, and the suffering had been too much for her to bear, and she fell into her brother's arms as if all life had gone out of her. "She is innocent indeed," said her eldest brother, and he told them all that had happened. And while he spoke, the scent of 1,000,000 roses filled the air, for every piece of wood that they had piled up to burn her had taken root and grown branches. There stood a great high hedge, covered with red and fragrant roses. At the very top a single pure white flower shone like a star. The king plucked it and put it on Elisa's breast, and she awoke with peace and happiness in her heart. All the church bells began to ring of their own accord, and the air was filled with birds. Back to the palace went a bridal procession such as no king has ever enjoyed before. All right, here's another fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen. The Emperor's New Clothes, written in 1837. Many years ago, there was an emperor so exceedingly fond of new clothes that he spent all his money on being well dressed. He cared nothing about reviewing his soldiers, going to the theater, or going for a ride in his carriage, except to show off his new clothes. He had a coat for every hour of the day, and instead of saying, as one might about any other ruler, "The king's in council," here they always said, "The emperor is in his dressing room." In the great city where he lived, life was always gay. Every day many strangers came to town, and among them one day came two swindlers. They let it be known they were weavers, and they said they could weave the most magnificent fabrics imaginable. Not only were their colors and patterns uncommonly fine, but clothes made of this cloth had a wonderful way of becoming invisible to anyone who was unfit for his office or who was unusually stupid. Those would be just the clothes for me, thought the emperor. If I wore them, I would be able to discover which men in my empire are unfit for their posts. And I could tell the wise men from the fools. Yes, I certainly must get some of this stuff woven for me right away. He paid the two swindlers a large sum of money to start work at once. They set up the two looms and pretended to weave, though there was nothing on the looms. All the finest silk and the purest gold thread which they demanded went into their traveling bags, while they worked the empty looms far into the night. I'd like to know how those weavers are getting on with the cloth, the emperor thought, but he felt slightly uncomfortable when he remembered that those who were unfit for their position would not be able to see the fabric. It couldn't have been that he doubted himself, yet he thought he'd rather send someone else to see how things were going. The whole town knew about the cloth's peculiar power, and all were impatient to find out how stupid their neighbors were. I'll send my honest old minister to the weavers, the emperor decided. He'll be the best one to tell me how the material looks, for he's a sensible man, and no one does his duty better. So the honest old minister went to the room where the two swindlers sat working away at their empty looms. Heaven help me, he thought as his eyes flew wide open. I can't see anything at all. But he did not say so. Both the swindlers begged him to be so kind as to come near to approve the excellent pattern, the beautiful colors. They pointed to the empty looms, and the poor old minister stared as hard as he dared. He couldn't see anything because there was nothing to see. Heaven have mercy, he thought. Can it be that I'm a fool? I'd never have guessed it, and not a soul must know. Am I unfit to be the minister? It would never do to let on that I can't see the cloth. Now, don't hesitate to tell us what you think of it, said one of the weavers. Oh, it's beautiful, and it's enchanting, the old minister peered through his spectacles. Such a pattern, what colors! I'll be sure to tell the emperor how delighted I am with it. We're pleased to hear that, the swindlers said. They proceeded to name all the colors and to explain the intricate pattern. The old minister paid the closest attention so that he could tell it all to the emperor. And so he did. The swindlers at once asked for more money, more silk, and gold thread to get on with the weaving. But it all went into their pockets. Not a thread went into the looms, though they worked at their weavings as hard as ever. The emperor presently sent another trustworthy official to see how the work progressed and how soon it would be ready. The same thing happened to him that had happened to the minister. He looked and he looked, but just as there was nothing to see in the looms, he couldn't see anything. Isn't it a beautiful piece of goods? The swindlers asked him, as they displayed and described their imaginary pattern. I know I'm not stupid, the man thought, so it must be that I'm unworthy of my good office. That's strange. I mustn't let anyone find it out, though. So he praised the material he did not see. He declared he was delighted with the beautiful colors and the exquisite pattern. To the emperor he said, "It held me spellbound." All the town was talking of this splendid cloth, and the emperor wanted to see it for himself while it was still in the looms. Attended by a band of chosen men, among whom were his two old trusted officials, the ones who had been to the weavers, he set out to see the two swindlers. He found them weaving with might and main, but without a thread in their looms. Magnificent, said the two officials already duped. Just look, your majesty, what colors, what a design. They pointed to the empty looms, each supposing that the others could see the stuff. What's this? Thought the emperor. I can't see anything. This is terrible. Am I a fool? Am I unfit to be the emperor? What a thing to happen to me, of all people. Oh, it's very pretty, he said. It has my highest approval. And he nodded approbation at the empty loom. Nothing could make him say that he couldn't see anything. His whole retinue stared and stared. One saw no more than the other. But they all joined the emperor in exclaiming, "Oh, it's very pretty," and they advised him to wear clothes made of this wonderful cloth, especially for the great procession he was soon to lead. Magnificent, excellent, unsurpassed, were bandied from mouth to mouth, and everyone did his best to seem well pleased. The emperor gave each of the swindlers a cross to wear in his buttonhole and the title of Sir Weaver. Before the procession, the swindlers sat up all night and burned more than 6 candles to show how busy they were finishing the emperor's new clothes. They pretended to take the cloth off the loom, they made cuts in the air with huge scissors, and at last they said, "Now the emperor's new clothes are ready for him." Then the emperor himself came with his noblest noblemen, and the swindlers each raised an arm as if they were holding something. They said, "These are the trousers, and here's the coat, and this is the mantle," naming each garment. All of them are as light as a spider web. One would almost think he had nothing on. But that's what makes them so fine. Exactly, all the noblemen agreed, though they could see nothing, for there was nothing to see. "If your imperial majesty will consent to take your clothes off," said the swindlers, "we will help you on with your new ones here in front of the long mirror." The emperor undressed, and the swindlers pretended to put his new clothes on him, one garment after another. They took him around the waist and seemed to be fastening something, that was his train, as the emperor turned round and round before the looking-glass. "How well your majesty's new clothes look! Aren't they becoming?" he heard on all sides. "That pattern, so perfect, those colors, so suitable. It is a magnificent outfit." Then the Minister of Public Processions announced, "Your Majesty's canopy is awaiting outside." "Well, I'm supposed to be ready," the emperor said, and turned again for one last look in the mirror. "It is a remarkable fit, isn't it?" He seemed to regard his costume with the greatest interest. The noblemen who were to carry his train stooped low and reached for the floor as if they were picking up his mantle. Then they pretended to lift and hold it high. They didn't dare admit that they had nothing to hold. So off went the emperor in procession under his splendid canopy. Everyone in the streets and in the windows said, "Oh, how fine are the emperor's new clothes! Don't they fit him to perfection? And see his long train!" Nobody would confess that he couldn't see anything, for that would prove him either unfit for his position or a fool. No costume the emperor had worn before was ever such a complete success. "But he hasn't got anything on," a little child said. "Did you ever hear such innocent prattle?" said its father, and one person whispered to another what the child had said. "He hasn't anything on. A child says he hasn't anything on." "But he hasn't got anything on," the whole town cried out at last. The emperor shivered, for he suspected that they were right. But he thought, this procession has got to go on, so he walked more proudly than ever, as his noblemen held high the train that wasn't there at all. There is another story by Hans Christian Andersen called The Daisy, written in 1838. Now listen to this. Out in the country, close by the side of the road, there stood a country house. You yourself have certainly seen many just like it. In front of it was a little flower garden, with a painted fence around it. Close by the fence, in the midst of the most beautiful green grass beside a ditch, there grew a little daisy. The sun shone just as warmly and brightly on her as on the beautiful flowers inside the garden, and so she grew every hour. Until at last one morning she was in full bloom, with shining petals spreading like rays around the little yellow sun in the center. The daisy didn't think that she was a little despised flower that nobody would notice down there in the grass. No, indeed, she was a merry little daisy, and she looked up at the warm sun and listened to the lark singing high in the sky. Yes, the little daisy was as happy as if this were a grand holiday, yet it was only a Monday, and all the children were in school. While they sat on their benches learning things, the daisy sat on her little green stalk and learned from the warm sun and everything about her just how good God is. The daisy couldn't talk, but high above her the lark sang loudly and beautifully all the things that the little flower felt, and that made the daisy very glad. The daisy looked up at the happy bird who could sing and fly, but she wasn't envious because she couldn't do those fine things too. I can see and hear, the daisy thought, and the sun shines on me and the forest kisses me. How gifted I am. Inside the fence stood all the stiff, proud flowers, and the less scent they had, the more they seemed to strut. The peonies blew themselves out and tried to make themselves bigger than the roses, but size alone isn't enough. The tulips knew that they had the brightest colors and held themselves very straight, so that they could be seen more clearly. None of them noticed the little daisy outside, but the daisy could see them and thought, how rich and beautiful they are. I'm sure the pretty lark flies across to them and visits them. Thank God that I stand close enough so that I can see them. But just as she thought that, Kvit came down the lark. He didn't come down to see the peonies or the tulips. No, indeed, he flew right down into the grass to the poor daisy, who was so overjoyed that she didn't know what to think. The little bird danced around the daisy and sang, how soft the grass is here, and what a lovely little flower, with gold in her heart and silver on her dress. You see, the yellow heart of the daisy looked like gold, and the little petals around it were silvery white. How happy the little daisy was, no one can conceive. The bird kissed her with his beak, sang to her, and then flew up again into the bright blue air. It was at least a quarter of an hour before the daisy could recover from her joy. Then, almost ashamed, yet sincerely happy, she peeped over at the flowers in the garden, for they had seen the honor and happiness that had come to her and would understand her joy. But the tulips stood up twice as stiff as before and looked very haughty and very red in the face because they were very annoyed. The fat-headed peonies were jealous. Bah! And it was lucky they couldn't speak, or the daisy would have received a good scolding. The poor little flower could see they were not in a good humor, and that made her very sad. Just then, a girl with a great sharp, shining knife came into the garden, went straight up to the tulips, and cut them off, one after the other. Oh my, sighed the daisy. That's dreadful. It's all over with them now. Then the girl took the tulips away, and the daisy was glad that she was only a poor little flower that nobody would notice out in the grass. Yes, she felt very grateful indeed. The sun went down, and the little daisy folded her leaves and went to sleep, and dreamed all night about the sun and the pretty bird. The next morning, when the flower again happily stretched out her white petals like little arms toward the early sun, she recognized the voice of the lark, but this time the song was mournful and sad. Yes, the poor lark had good reason to be sad. You see, he had been caught, and now sat in a cage close by an open window of the house. He sadly sang of the free and happy roaming he used to do, and of the young green corn in the fields, of the glorious journeys he used to make on his wings high up through the air. The poor bird was very unhappy, for there he was, a prisoner, in a cage. How the little daisy wished she could help him, but what could she do? Yes, that was difficult to figure out. She quite forgot how beautiful the world was, how warm the sun shone, and how wonderfully white were her own petals. She could only try to think of the poor little bird and how powerless she was to help him. Suddenly, two little boys came out of the garden, and one of them was carrying a big sharp knife, like that which the girl had used to cut the tulips. They went straight up to the little daisy, who could not understand what was going on. Here, we can cut a fine piece of turf for the lark, said one of the boys. Then he began to cut out a square patch of grass around the daisy, so that the little flower remained standing in the middle of it. Tear off that flower, said the other boy, and the daisy trembled with fear. To be torn off would mean losing her life, and she wanted so much to live now and go with the turf to the captive lark. No, leave it there, the other boy said. It looks pretty. And then the daisy, in a little patch of sod, was put into the lark's cage. But the poor bird was complaining about his lost liberty and beating his wings against the wires of his prison, and the little daisy couldn't speak, couldn't console him, however much she wanted to, and thus the morning passed. There is no water here, cried the captive lark. They've all gone away and have forgotten to give me anything to drink. My throat's dry and burning. I feel as if I had fire and ice within me, and the air is so close. Oh, I must die. I must leave the warm sunshine and the fresh green and all the splendor that God has created." But when he thrust his beak into the cool turf to refresh himself a little, his eye fell upon the daisy who was trying so hard to speak to him. He kissed her with his beak and said, "You must also wither in here, poor little flower. They've given me you and your little patch of green grass instead of the whole world that was mine out there. Every little blade of your grass shall be a green tree for me, and every one of your white leaves a fragrant flower. Ah, seeing you only tells me again how much I have lost." Oh, if I could only help and comfort him, thought the daisy. She couldn't move a leaf, but the scent that streamed forth from her delicate leaves was far stronger than a daisy ever gave forth before. The lark noticed it, and though in his thirst and pain he plucked at the blades of grass, he did not touch the flower. The evening came, and still nobody appeared to bring the bird a single drop of water. At last the lark stretched out his pretty wings and beat the air desperately. His song changed to a mournful peeping, and his little head sank down toward the flower, and his little bird's heart broke with want and yearning, and the little flower couldn't fold its leaves in sleep as she had done the night before. She too drooped sorrowful and sick toward the earth. It wasn't until the next morning that the boys came, and when they found the bird dead, they wept many tears and dug him a neat grave, adorned with leaves and flowers. They put him into a pretty red box, for the poor bird was to have a royal funeral. While he was alive and singing, they forgot him and let him sit and occasion suffer, but now that he was dead, he was to have many tears and a royal funeral. But the patch of turf with the little daisy on it was thrown out into the dusty road, and no one thought any more of the flower that had felt the deepest for the little bird and had tried so hard to console him and help him.